Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in for the 4 o'clock show. We were here earlier this morning with developer Jason Fain after last night's Ordinance Committee meeting at the Providence City Council. You can see that on GoLocalProv.com. But as we do most Tuesday afternoons at 4 p.m., we check in with Jennifer Lawless down at the University of Virginia. Jennifer, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
We're doing well up here. Sun's coming out in downtown Providence after having a tornado warning. You can read about the National Weather Service's warning that was in effect until 4 on GoLocalProv. But now it's sunny. A lot of focus on national but international politics right now and the relations to the current administration. Now let's talk a little bit about where things are at with the investigation into the disappearance and death of Jamal Khashoggi, and where things stand with Saudi Arabia, the U.S., and Turkey.
In the last 24 hours or so, it seems like Turkey has superseded the United States in being the most outraged regarding the death. And so over the weekend, we saw members of Congress say that it was important to get to the bottom of this. We even saw Donald Trump in the last few days start to acknowledge that the Saudi story seemed a little bit strange and that it was unacceptable and that they were going to be investigating more. But just recently, we've now heard that Turkey has basically said, look, you killed somebody on the wrong country's soil, and it's not acceptable, even though it was at a diplomatic embassy, which means that Turkey doesn't technically have jurisdiction. The Turkish government is already trying to investigate ways to work with the global community to figure out how to engage in investigations when things like this happen, because the Saudis basically delayed for almost 2 weeks before any sort of investigation could take place.
And what we saw from the Saudis, their explanation was that a fight had occurred after Khashoggi had entered the embassy. Now, we did see the president basically say, not really buying that explanation. Are you surprised that the president countered what the Saudis had come with, especially right after the incident? He seemed rather aligned with allowing them to dictate the reaction.
I think a couple of things happened. The first was he saw that his view was completely out of sync, not only with liberals and Democrats, but even with members of his own party. The second thing that happened was the fistfight story just on its face doesn't make any sense for two reasons. The first is that there's no way that Khashoggi could have put up such a fight given that he would be fighting with 12 other people. They wouldn't have had to kill him in order to suppress him or contain him or do whatever it was they were attempting to do. The second factor is that the Saudis had footage of a body double leaving the embassy disguised as Khashoggi, and that was what their story had been up until this point. And so that means that this seems like it was just sort of a last-minute attempt to admit that they murdered him, and this seemed like a plausible, to them at least, story to explain why.
And what do we think we see as repercussions now moving forward, as Turkey has indicated they're going to be much more involved in trying to investigate what transpired at the embassy? We've seen now the president react as well. What do you envision moving forward?
Well, one of the things that I think we can count on is that if the president doesn't act, and if the president doesn't do something where, if not sanctions, there are real consequences to this behavior, Congress will act. And it wouldn't be the first time Congress acted when the president wouldn't act when it came to Russian sanctions as well. The other thing that's important to keep in mind here is that it's sort of ironic that Turkey is launching this investigation because they've actually had one of the worst records in terms of jailing and restraining journalists globally. So, this is one of those situations where the United States could have obviously taken a strong leadership role, opted not to, now seems to be getting on board, but Donald Trump is not going to be seen as the person who really spearheaded an investigation.
Speaking of international relations, a lot of the time and attention in national media is currently placed on the thousands of people now in Mexico heading towards the U.S. border. Talk with us a little bit about sort of the inside the Beltway take. It seems both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are trying to play this to their advantage.
The Republicans are certainly trying to play it to their advantage. They are discussing this caravan as though it's perfectly timed for the midterm elections. And as though the people who are trying to get through Mexico and ultimately cross the border are not doing it for any reason other than to violate immigration law, right? The Republicans are not in any way acknowledging that some of these people are seeking asylum, that many of them are coming from very, very dangerous places and circumstances. The Republicans are also trying to politicize this, not only because it's consistent with their immigration policies, but they're misleading. They're saying that there are Middle Easterners. They're saying that there are suspected terrorists among these people trying to cross the border. And as a result, that fear-mongering, they hope, will allow people to say, you know what, this is a dangerous time. We're going to continue to elect our incumbents because we feel safer when we know what the government looks like. The Democrats, on the other hand, are calling the Republicans bluff. They hope it's a bluff. And they're saying that this is just one more example of the Republicans trying to scare people and use these scare tactics in a discriminatory way. So we'll see what's going on. But Republican candidates across the country, both for the Senate and the House of Representatives, have already begun running ads and using this kind of language to get voters out to the polls in these final 2 weeks.
And let's talk about if and when this does reach the U.S. border and the role that the president could potentially play. Now, as you said, he has insinuated that there might be some folks who might not be there for the pure purposes of escaping some hardships. But if there are, in fact, those individuals who have bona fide cases for asylum, do you think we'll see a really big issue come to a head in the way that the U.S. reacts to who they let in and how? Or is there a possibility that the president, as he's been saying, could shut the border down completely?
I think a lot depends on the timing. A lot depends on when they get there. And a lot depends on if they arrive after the election, whether the Republicans took back control of the House and whether the Republicans gained seats in the Senate. It's a very, very political question, and the extent to which Donald Trump has political capital and leverage around that question is going to be much clearer in 2 weeks. But I wouldn't be surprised if the rhetoric until that point is about shutting down the border. And I wouldn't be surprised if on the Democratic side, the rhetoric is not about separating families. And so they're going to suggest that when these families that have, taken major personal risks arrive at the border, families are going to be separated, mothers aren't going to see their children. And that actually over the summer was a very, very effective message for the Democrats, and it chipped away at some of Donald Trump's support, even among independents.
As we stand here and sit here, it is 2 weeks from Election Day today. As we always talk, 24 hours can be a lifetime in politics, but this really seems to be that issue that national news is harping on, that both of the parties are harping on. Do you envision this really sort of taking up the oxygen moving forward towards November 6th?
Well, the Democrats, I think, hope not. They would like health care to be front and center. They know that they're able to garner much more support when they're talking about that. I think the Republicans would like to be talking about the economy. Republican candidates certainly would like to be talking about the economy more than immigration, but Donald Trump doesn't seem to care. And Donald Trump is conducting more than a dozen rallies between now and Election Day, and it matters in part what he says, not what the Republican candidates are trying to say and what their messages are. So my hunch is that because Trump feels so comfortable talking about immigration, because this has been part of his stump speech since he first announced and came down that escalator in Trump Tower, it is what we're going to hear about, and it is going to suck the oxygen, even though neither party wants to talk about it right now.
Well, we'll see what we have to talk about this time next week when we are just a week away from the elections. But as always, Jennifer, appreciate picking your brain as to what's taking place close to the Beltway to give us the report back here on Island. Jennifer Lawless down at the University of Virginia, thank you as always for Skyping in.
Of course.
Okay, we'll talk soon. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center as we go from politics to education.